The rust-licked dawn bled through my window blinds, painting the dust motes in the air with a sickly orange glow. Another day, identical to the last, stretched before me like an endless gray road. I traced the rim of a chipped ceramic mug, the scent of stale coffee clinging to the air, a familiar companion to the quiet hum of my self-imposed exile. The city's distant murmur was a tide I no longer swam against, just watched from the shore, a derelict lighthouse keeper to a sea of indifferent lights. My hand drifted, unbidden, to the scarred wooden surface of the table, fingers brushing against the cold metal of a forgotten badge. It was a phantom weight, the memory of its presence on my belt a constant ache. Cole. The name tasted foreign, a title I'd shed like old skin, yet the ghost of the man who wore it still paced the confined spaces of my mind. It had been years since the Whisperer case had splintered my world, leaving me adrift, a broken compass in a storm of unanswered questions. Every shadow held the echo of my failure, every silence the ghost of what I hadn't heard. The shrill cry of my phone, a sound I usually ignored, tore through the fragile peace. It was a number I hadn't seen in too long, a name that belonged to a different life. The chief. I let it ring once, twice, a silent battle waged within the tight confines of my chest. Then a sigh heavy with resignation escaped me. I picked it up. Cole, the chief's voice crackled, laced with an urgency that tightened the knot in my gut. No pleasantries, no gentle easing. This was the voice of a man standing on the edge of a precipice. They hit the cargo plane on abandoned runway, just happened, overnight. My grip tightened around the phone, the cargo plane on abandoned runway. A place I knew, a desolate stretch of cracked tarmac and skeletal hangars far from the city's watchful eye. A forgotten scar on the Earth's face. It was a ghost ship of a location perfectly chosen for a ghost of a crime. What did they take? My voice was a low rasp, unused to the sudden demand. Not much monetarily, the chief replied, a strange note of bewilderment in his tone. Some specialized avionics equipment, high-end navigation tech. But that's not the point, Cole. It's the way they did it, folded perfectly. He was found on the pilot's seat, untouched. Everything else was pristine, no forced entry, no alarms tripped, like they just walked in. The words struck me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. The world tilted, the room blurring at the edges. A white origami crane. My vision swam, not with the chief's words, but with an image from another time, another crime. A small, polished river stone precisely placed on a victim's pillow. A single, perfectly tied silk ribbon draped over a stolen artifact. Cole, the chief said, his voice softer now, tinged with a weariness that spoke volumes. Because I was the only one who ever truly understood his methods, and because the details, they're too precise, too deliberate. It's him, or someone who studied him intimately. My mind raced, a frantic kaleidoscope of fractured memories. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, a desperate need to dismiss it, to rationalize it away as coincidence, as a macabre imitation. Was I so desperate for a pattern, I was forging one from the embers of my past. There was my haunted mind simply projecting its old demons onto a new canvas. Where's the scene now? I asked, the question escaping before I could truly weigh its implications. The words were a betrayal, a promise broken to myself. Forensics are just wrapping up, still quiet out there. I haven't even released the full details to the media yet, wanted you to hear it first. He was offering me an olive branch, or perhaps more accurately, a poisoned apple. A chance to re-enter the world I'd been cast out from, but at what cost? The decision was made not by conscious choice, but by an ancient primal pull. My quiet retreat, my carefully constructed peace, had crumbled. The hunt had begun anew. The disgraced detective was dead, but the hunter, it seemed, had only been sleeping. And now he was wide awake. The engine hummed a mournful dirge, a counterpoint to the restless thrumming beneath my ribs. Each mile marker swallowed by the headlights felt less like progress and more like a descent into the very pit I'd clawed my way out of. The city lights, once a comforting sprawl, now receded in the rearview mirror like a fading promise. I was heading into the pre-dawn gloom, drawn by a summons that felt less like an invitation and more like a curse. The ghost of a whisper, almost a sigh, seemed to ride shotgun, reminding me of the price of this re-entry. The air grew sharper, carrying the metallic tang of jet fuel and the desolate scent of overgrown weeds. The paved road dissolved into cracked asphalt, then gravel, spitting tiny stones against the undercarriage. Finally, the landscape opened up, revealing a vast, flat expanse where skeletal remnants of forgotten industry pierced the bruised sky. And there it was, a grounded leviathan, its metallic skin dulled by countless suns and rains, sprawling across a concrete scar on the Earth's face. The cargo plane on an abandoned runway. Even from a distance, I could see the swarm. Emergency lights pulsed like frantic heartbeats, painting the scene in strobing reds and blues. Figures moved with a practiced urgency, their breath pluming in the crisp air. I cut the engine, plunging the immediate vicinity into a sudden, unnerving silence, broken only by the distant murmur of voices and the occasional crackle of a radio. He stood leaning against a patrol cruiser, his arms crossed, a thermos clutched in one hand. His gaze, even in the dim light, held a complicated mix of skepticism and a grudging respect I hadn't earned in years. He didn't offer a handshake, and I didn't expect one. Morning, I replied, the word feeling rough on my tongue. My eyes were already scanning beyond him, dissecting the scene. Rough one, he stated, pushing off the cruiser. They hit it sometime after midnight, clean, too clean. He gestured vaguely towards the plane. Cargo manifest said high-value electronics, gone without a trace, alarms bypassed, security systems rendered inert, not a single forced entry point, not a single witness, just emptiness. The pilot, I asked, my gaze fixed on the plane's fuselage. Found him in the cockpit unharmed, sedated, woke up an hour ago, remembers nothing after pre-flight checks. No struggle, no sign of violence. A prick, it was too familiar. They boarded, sedated him, unloaded, and vanished, like ghosts. Local boys are baffled, think it's professionals, highly organized. But he trailed off, catching up to me, his voice dropping. The way they did it, Cole, it's precise, surgical. I didn't need him to elaborate. The cargo plane on abandoned runway was a gaping maw. The rear ramp, usually a sturdy barrier, was now lowered, revealing the cavernous interior. The scent of ozone, faint but distinct, clung to singed wires, mingling with the stale smell of jet fuel and something else. A faint, metallic tang that spoke of residual fear. The cargo hold was vast and desolate. Straps, meant to secure crates, lay coiled on the floor, unbound and abandoned. There were no scattered fragments, no signs of a hurried escape. It was almost pristine, as if the electronics had simply dissolved into the ether. No scuffs, no drag marks that would indicate heavy crates being hastily pulled out. This wasn't a smash and grab. This was choreographed. My gaze drifted to a small, almost imperceptible detail near the edge of the lowered ramp. A tiny scorch mark, no larger than a thumbnail, on the tough, industrial-grade rubber matting. It wasn't from a spark or a dropped cigarette. It was too precise, too isolated, and next to it, almost hidden in a crease, was a fragment. I picked it up. It felt unnervingly smooth between my fingers. "What is it?" the colleague asked, peering over my shoulder. "Nothing," I murmured, tucking it into a small evidence bag I always carried. A lie, it was everything, a calling card, a signature. I straightened up, my eyes narrowing as I surveyed the scene again. The scorch marked the obsidian. And then I noticed something else, something that prickled the hairs on my arms. On the interior wall of the fuselage, just above where the cargo would have been stacked, was a faint, almost invisible etching. It wasn't graffiti, not a random scratch. It was a symbol, precise and unsettlingly familiar. A stylized bird, its wings outstretched, rendered with an almost elegant cruelty. His brow furrowed. They disabled the security, sedated the pilot, took the cargo. I began, my mind racing, piecing together fragments of a puzzle I wished wasn't forming. They were meticulous, professional. Why leave this? I pointed to the faint etching. It's a flourish, an unnecessary detail, something a ghost wouldn't do. He squinted, trying to make out the mark, but the light was poor and it was deliberately subtle. A calling card, a taunt? Perhaps, I conceded, but my gut churned. The killer I hunted years ago, the one who had shattered my world, had been methodical, yes, but also a showman. He wanted to be seen even as he vanished, but this heist, it was almost too clean, too professional, too devoid of personality, save for these two almost missed details. The obsidian, the etching, it wasn't just a copycat, it was something else. Someone was sending a message, or perhaps someone was playing a very specific kind of cruel joke. The ghost I thought I'd buried was stirring, and it was demanding my attention. My personal stake, once a distant echo, now pressed against me, a suffocating weight. The decision was made. I was in. The city slept, or at least pretended to, but my mind, a restless tide, pulled at the edges of slumber. The image of the second heist, its stark efficiency, the way it had been executed with such clinical detachment, still clung to my thoughts like a shroud. Too clean, I'd mused, too professional, too devoid of personality. My old quarry, the phantom who had etched his name into the very architecture of my nightmares, had been a meticulous architect of terror, yes, but also a connoisseur of performance. He craved the spotlight, however veiled. These new shadows, however, moved with a different grace, a silent, almost humble proficiency that unsettled me more than any grandstanding. Then the shrill cry of the television, an anchor's voice slicing through the pre-dawn quiet, jolted me upright. My gaze snapped to the screen. A breaking news banner, scarlet and urgent, pulsed beneath a grainy aerial shot. Unprecedented breach, high-value shipment, cargo plane on abandoned runway. My breath caught. This was it. The escalation I had felt brewing, a storm gathering on the horizon. This wasn't merely a vault or a gallery, this was a theatrical leap, a brazen act of defiance against the very notion of secure transport. My fingers fumbled for the remote, volume surging. The report detailed the audacious theft. A specialized shipment, something rare and prohibitively expensive, destined for an overseas buyer, had vanished from a seemingly impenetrable storage facility. Its last known location before disappearance, a heavy-duty cargo plane on an abandoned runway miles outside the city limits. The plane itself, a hulking metal beast, now sat empty, its cavernous maw agape, a monument to absence. No alarms tripped, no witnesses, no struggle. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking. To orchestrate such a feat, to move something of that magnitude, required not just skill but an intricate network, a logistics nightmare flawlessly executed. The lack of personality. A text message vibrated against the worn wood of my table. It was from a former colleague, a detective I used to share late-night stakeouts with, a man whose trust I'd likely forfeited. Saw the news? I thinking what I'm thinking, Cole? I didn't reply. The drive out to the abandoned airfield was a blur of highway and desolate scrubland. My mind raced, trying to find the crack in the perfect veneer, the flaw in the flawless execution. Where was it here? The sun climbed higher as I navigated the perimeter of the airfield, the chain-link fence a rusted serpent winding through overgrown weeds. Official vehicles, their lights flashing a silent warning, dotted the distant tarmac. The air grew heavy with the scent of jet fuel and damp earth. The cargo plane on abandoned runway loomed, a metal behemoth against the pale sky. Its cargo door, wide open, revealed an interior stripped bare. Uniformed officers milled about, their voices hushed, their movements methodical. I kept my distance, a ghost haunting the edges of their investigation. A small, almost imperceptible detail snagged my attention. Near the ramp where the heavy cargo would have been wheeled out, a faint, almost transparent sheen coated the concrete. Not oil, not water. I knelt, my fingers brushing the surface. A residue, industrial-grade adhesive, perhaps, used to secure something heavy during transit, then meticulously removed. But why leave a trace, however faint? My gaze drifted upwards, to the plane's interior. The bare metal walls, scuffed and worn, offered little. But then high up near one of the overhead compartments, a tiny, almost invisible scratch. I reached, my fingers tracing the shallow groove. It was too deliberate to be accidental, not a random scrape from a forklift, but a precise, almost artistic etching. A stylized bird in flight, its wings spread wide, captured in a single, elegant line. My breath hitched. My vision blurred for a second, the world tilting on its axis. The bird. It was the same symbol, the same cryptic signature the killer from years ago had occasionally left behind, a mocking flourish only I had ever truly recognized. It had been his mark, his secret boast, usually carved into something inconsequential, a discarded tool, a hidden corner. I had dismissed the first two heists as merely professional, devoid of his particular brand of theatrical malice. But this was undeniable. He was back, and he was playing a much grander game. A harsh voice cut through my focus. "Cole, what the hell are you doing here?" I straightened, my heart a dull drum against my ribs. It was the lead detective, a burly man with eyes that had seen too much, his face etched with suspicion. He stood before me, arms crossed, his uniform crisp, a stark contrast to my rumpled clothes and haunted expression. "Just observing," I managed, my voice rough. "Observing. You're trespassing, Cole. This is an active crime scene. You're not a detective anymore. You're not even a consultant." His gaze hardened, a flinty challenge. "You got a bad habit of showing up at these things. Makes some people wonder." "Wonder what?" I pushed back, a spark of my old fire igniting. "Wonder if you're just a magnet for trouble or if you're looking for something specific." There was I, the bird symbol, so faint, so easily dismissed. Was it just a random scratch? My mind warping it into something familiar. Had I been so wrong about the personality, only to be wrong about the signature too? My old colleague had warned me off, and now this. The official attention was unwelcome, but the doubt it planted in my own mind was far more insidious. "I know this," I said, the words tasting like ash. "This isn't just a heist." The detective scoffed, a dismissive sound. "It's a very sophisticated theft, Cole. That's all it is. Stay out of it. For your own good." He turned, striding away to bark orders at his team. I watched him go, the weight of his words pressing down. But then my eyes drifted back to the faint etching, the stylized bird on the cargo plane's wall. No, I couldn't be wrong. It was too specific, too personal. It was a taunt. He wasn't just back, he was daring me. He knew I would see it. He was playing with me just as he always had. And I, disgraced or not, was the only one who truly understood the game. The stakes had just been raised to an unbearable height. The detective's words, sharp as shattered glass, still echoed in the cavernous warehouse, but my gaze had already slipped free of their hold. It was the faint etching, barely a whisper on the metal plating, that snagged my sight. Not a symbol, not a letter, but a sequence. 10/27/08. A date. A precise, unyielding mark. My breath hitched. It was the anniversary of the first disappearance. The one that had spiraled into the unholy chaos of my last case. The one that had unraveled me. A dull ache began to throb behind my eyes, a familiar phantom limb of memory. The uniform, still barking orders, seemed to shrink, fading into the periphery as the date burned itself onto my retina. I knew, with the cold certainty of a man who has walked too many dark paths, that this was no mere coincidence. The uniform's dismissive tone, the veiled threat, were merely static now. My path was set, a magnetic pull toward the precipice of what I knew was coming. Back in the quiet solitude of my apartment, the air hung heavy with the scent of old paper and stale coffee. I spread out the case files, their edges frayed with age and countless rereadings. My fingers, calloused from years of gripping a service weapon, now traced the faded ink of reports, the grainy photographs of faces that still haunted my sleep. I pulled up the initial reports from the recent heists, cross-referencing them with the meticulous records of my past failure. The current targets were disparate at first glance: a rare art collection from an insulated collector, vintage industrial schematics from a secured archive, and now this specific batch of specialized alloy from the warehouse. Valuables, yes, but of such varied nature. What connected them? Beyond their monetary worth? I stared at the list, the names and addresses blurring into an indistinct haze. Then I remembered the etching, 10/27/08, the date. My fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for any connection to that specific day, that specific year within the existing targets. And then a flicker. A name. A minor figure in the periphery of the old case, someone associated with one of the victims. A materials engineer, responsible for developing a new alloy, precisely the kind stolen tonight. He had been a colleague of a witness who had vanished shortly after providing testimony in my old case. The art collector, I found with a jolt, had been a silent partner in a defunct tech firm that had folded under scandal, a firm whose lead researcher had also disappeared around 10/27/08. The industrial schematics belonged to a company that had supplied components to that very same tech firm. It wasn't about the items they stole, not solely. It was about the owners. Each target, no matter how disparate the stolen goods, possessed a direct, if sometimes tenuous, link to the forgotten echoes of 10/27/08. The serial killer hadn't just been targeting individuals, they had been dismantling a network, erasing a history. And now, they were doing it again. This wasn't simple greed. This was an excavation, a meticulous unearthing of something buried deep. The motive was not acquisition, but retribution or perhaps completion. The uniform had dismissed it as a sophisticated theft, but I saw the intricate, venomous web being respun. My gut twisted with a bitter certainty. This wasn't just mirroring the past, it was a continuation. The same phantom, having merely paused its macabre dance. My gaze fell upon a faded news clipping from my old case file. A blurred photograph of a smiling woman, one of the first victims. Her eyes, even in the poor print, held a spark of a life unjustly extinguished. Next to her, a brief mention of a small, privately funded research initiative he was part of, something about advanced material science. It had seemed inconsequential then, overshadowed by the brutal reality of her disappearance. Now it screamed. The stolen alloy, the industrial schematics, the tech firm, the materials engineer, all threads from the same loom. The 10/27/08 date wasn't just an anniversary, it was a pivot point, the genesis of a grand, sinister design. My heart, a drum against my ribs, beat a frantic rhythm. I had missed it then. Blinded by the obvious horror, I had failed to see the underlying architecture of the killer's intent. I pushed away from the table, a renewed urgency coursing through my veins. The pattern was undeniable, a mosaic of vengeance. But what was the next piece? What was the ultimate objective? The heists were too precise, too deliberate to be random acts of violence. They were collecting something, assembling a puzzle whose final image remained terrifyingly obscure. My mind raced, pulling at every loose string, every forgotten detail. The tech firm, the research initiative, the specific type of alloy. Where would someone assemble such disparate elements? Where would they hide or prepare for a grander move after meticulously collecting these pieces of a forgotten past? A memory surfaced, unbidden. A tip from years ago, dismissed as unreliable, about a secluded, forgotten airstrip sometimes used for illicit transport. It had been connected, however loosely, to a subsidiary of that very same defunct tech firm. A place far from prying eyes, perfect for clandestine operations. The air grew thick with unspoken possibilities. I grabbed my worn leather jacket, the weight of the files still heavy in my mind. The drive was a blur of streetlights and silent determination. The city dissolved behind me, replaced by the skeletal forms of winter-bare trees and the vast, indifferent expanse of the rural landscape. A narrow, crumbling access road, barely visible. The tires crunched over gravel and potholes, the suspension groaning in protest. Before me, dominating the desolate stretch of cracked tarmac, was the cargo plane on abandoned runway. Its metal skin was scarred with rust, its windows opaque with grime, a silent sentinel of forgotten journeys. But something was off. A faint scent, not of decay, but of something sharp and industrial, lingered in the frigid air. And in the pale glow of the moon, I could just make out fresh tire tracks, cutting through the thin layer of frost that coated the runway. I hadn't expected to find anything. Perhaps just a dead end, another echo of my own flawed judgment. But the tracks were undeniably recent, etched deep into the frozen earth. Someone had been here, recently, and they had left their mark. My hand instinctively went to the comforting weight of the concealed weapon at my hip. The etched sequence 10-27-08 had burrowed into my thoughts like a splinter of ice. It wasn't just a string of numbers. It was a whisper from a tomb. That date, I knew it. It was the day the first shadow fell, the day the city held its breath and never quite exhaled. The disappearance of the architect's daughter. Not the first victim in the broader sense, but the first whose vanishing truly unraveled the threads of my world, pulling me into the labyrinth of a case that still haunted my waking hours. Her name was a ghost on my tongue, a constant reminder of the chasm that had swallowed my career, my reputation, my very self. I felt the phantom weight of old files in my hands, the grainy photographs of a girl with hopeful eyes, now merely a statistic in a cold, forgotten archive. The precision of the operations, the almost artistic signature left behind it, was the same meticulous hand, or a student so devoted they had surpassed the master. My search for answers began in the stale air of a forgotten cafe, the kind where the aroma of burnt sugar and old coffee clung to the faded wallpaper. I needed to rattle a cage, to stir a viper's nest that had long been dormant. He had been a low-level operator back then, a peripheral figure who saw things from the edges, piecing together fragments others dismissed. He was a ghost of my past, just like the case. "The old days," I murmured, sliding a folded bill across the scarred tabletop. "The architect's girl, the date, it's back." The informant's gaze flickered, a spark of fear in the depths of his rheumy eyes. "You stir that mud, you find what's buried, and it ain't always just bones." "Where is he?" I pressed, my voice low, insistent. The one who always saw more than he let on, the one who spoke of the collector. A long sigh, heavy with resignation, escaped the informant. He named a place, a forgotten landmark on the city's industrial fringe, a place where metal rusted and ambitions died. He spoke of a contact, a former associate of the architect's circle, a man who had once handled sensitive transactions. The drive was long, the urban sprawl giving way to skeletal trees and abandoned factories, their broken windows like vacant eyesores. Finally, the road crumbled into a cracked asphalt path leading to an expanse of desolate concrete. And there it was, a hulking silhouette against the twilight sky, a cargo plane on abandoned runway. Its metal skin, once gleaming, was now mottled with rust, its windows opaque with grime. It looked like a fallen titan, forgotten by time and progress. The scent of stale fuel and dust filled my nostrils as I stepped inside. The interior was a cavernous space, stripped bare of its cargo racks, save for a few scattered crates and oil drums. The contact, a gaunt figure with a shock of white hair and eyes like polished stones, emerged from behind a stack of empty crates. He was older, thinner than I remembered, but the same wary intelligence burned in his gaze. He clutched a worn, leather-bound journal to his chest. "I imagine you know why I'm here," I said, keeping my voice steady, my eyes scanning the periphery, alert for any other movement. He gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "The date, always the date. 10-27-08, a bookmark, wouldn't you say, for the architect's masterpiece." Masterpiece? The word tasted bitter on my tongue. "You knew what was happening back then, didn't you? What did he call himself? The collector. What did he collect?" The contact's grip tightened on the journal. He saw himself as an artist, a sculptor of destinies, the architect's daughter. He was the cornerstone of his grand design. The date, Cole, it wasn't just him disappearance. It was the completion of his first phase, the day he truly believed he had perfected his method. My breath hitched. Completion. I'd always seen it as a beginning, the start of the hunt, not an end. What method? He believed in resonance, each step, each target chosen for its symbolic weight. The architect's daughter represented creation, the spark, and the date. It marked the transition. Transition to what? I pressed, stepping closer. What was his next step? He hesitated, licking his dry lips. He had a secondary location, a place of refinement. It was tied to the date, too. A place he always visited on the anniversary. A warehouse deep underground. He called it the vault. A warehouse. My mind flashed back to the faint etching on the metal plating, the exact sequence, not just a date, but a recurring marker. The vault, I repeated, the name echoing ominously in the vast space. Where is it? Before he could answer, a sudden, violent crack split the air. Not a gunshot, but the sickening thud of metal on flesh. The contact crumpled, his eyes wide with surprise and pain, the leather journal flying from his grasp. It skittered across the grimy floor, coming to rest near my feet. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. My pistol was out in an instant, but the attacker was already upon me. A swift, brutal kick caught me in the ribs, sending a searing pain through my side and knocking the wind from my lungs. I stumbled back, my head hitting the cold metal wall of the fuselage with a jarring impact. Stars exploded behind my eyes. I fought to regain my footing, my vision swimming. The attacker was a phantom, striking with precision and power. I grunted, rolling with the impact, desperately trying to create space. Lifeless. Again, the past repeating itself, mocking my efforts. I scrambled on hands and knees towards the fallen journal, a desperate surge of adrenaline coursing through me. This was it, the only tangible link left. But the attacker was quicker. A heavy boot descended, crushing my outstretched fingers, a white-hot agony shooting up my arm. I cried out, recoiling. The attacker bent, retrieving the journal with a swift, economical movement. Their gaze, if it could be called that, lingered on me for a fraction of a second, an unsettling stillness in the hooded face. I lay there, gasping, the metallic tang of blood filling my mouth. My ribs screamed, my hand throbbed with a pain that threatened to consume me. The cargo plane was silent once more, save for the low moan of the wind. The contact was dead, and the journal, the last thread of information, was gone. The date, 10/27/08, now felt like a curse. I was a step behind, always a step behind, and the weight of that failure pressed down on me, heavy as the rusting hull of the abandoned plane. The metallic thud echoed, a brutal punctuation. It wasn't the clean crack of a bone, but the sickening thwack of dense metal impacting yielding flesh. The informant crumpled, a marionette with severed strings, his eyes wide and unseeing, fixed on a patch of grimy wall. The leather journal, a dark bird startled from its perch, fluttered from his grasp. It skittered across the concrete, coming to rest near my worn boots, a silent accusation. From the depth of the alley's gloom, a form detached itself. Tall, lean, moving with a predator's economy, a shadow given malevolent purpose. A shard of ice pierced my chest, lodging itself deep. This wasn't a street mugging. This was precise. My hand instinctively reached for the journal, its worn leather a sudden, desperate comfort, even as my gaze flicked to the approaching assailant. I scooped the book, its weight unexpectedly substantial, and spun on the ball of my foot. Retreat. The only viable option. Not a fight I could win, not yet, not without knowing what unseen forces I was up against. A blur of movement behind me, a hand reaching, grazing my shoulder. I ducked, darting through the labyrinth of discarded crates and overflowing dumpsters, the assailant's footsteps a relentless rhythm at my heels. Each clang of metal, each scuff of a boot, a drumbeat of pursuit. My breath rasped in my throat, a ragged sound swallowed by the night. The chase was short, brutal, punctuated by desperate leaps over rusted fences, tearing my jacket, scraping skin from my forearm. I didn't stop, didn't dare look back, until the skeletal silhouette of the cargo plane on abandoned runway loomed against the bruised dawn sky. I fumbled with the rusted latch, the metal groaning in protest, then forced the heavy door open. Only the faint sliver of light from a cracked window high above offered any solace. I leaned against a cold metal crate, my lungs burning, the journal clutched tight against my chest, its presence a fragile shield. I pulled out my small penlight, its beam a weak interrogation, and aimed it at the journal. The leather was supple, well-used, bearing the sheen of countless hours spent in hands. Inside, the pages were filled with a meticulous, almost artistic script. Not the informant's hurried scrawl, but something far more deliberate, more cultivated. It wasn't a diary of confessions, but a planner, a chronicle of ambition. Dates, locations, precise timings, all laid out with an unsettling clarity. Diagrams of bank layouts, security camera blind spots, escape routes. Each entry a blueprint of the recent heists, but annotated, critiqued, refined. It was the work of a mind that saw the world as a complex machine ripe for manipulation. Then I saw it. A series of faded newspaper clippings tucked between pages, yellowed with age, brittle to the touch. Not just reports of the recent crimes, but articles from years ago. My case. The serial killer's signature attacks. The details were eerily similar, not just the methods, but the philosophy behind them. A twisted sense of justice, a carefully orchestrated retribution. It wasn't about the money, not entirely. It was about a message. One clipping in particular was circled in vivid red ink, the grainy photo of a young woman, a victim from my past, her smile frozen in time. Underneath, a single, stark word, scrawled in the same elegant hand that filled the journal's pages. Unfinished. My breath hitched, catching in my throat. Unfinished. It wasn't just mirroring. It was a continuation. The informant wasn't just giving me a lead, he was handing me the entire twisted narrative. This wasn't a copycat. This was the second act. And the original killer was long dead by my own hand, a ghost I had wrestled into the ground years ago. Who could pick up such a mantle? Someone intimately familiar with the original's work. Someone who saw the gaps, the unfinished business. Someone who had been close. So close, perhaps, that they felt the same burning need for what they perceived as justice. I flipped through more pages, my fingers trembling, the penlight beam dancing across the meticulous script. A colleague from the force, another detective who had worked the original case alongside me. And then a crude, hurried sketch of my face. My jaw clenched, a knot of muscle tightening in my cheek. I was not just investigating. I was part of the design. A pawn, or perhaps the ultimate target. A tremor of self-doubt ran through me. There was I seeing what I wanted to see, projecting my guilt, my failures onto these pages. There was the journal simply a clever misdirection designed to lure me deeper into a labyrinth of my own making, a punishment for my past mistakes. But the details were too precise, the connections too undeniable. The language of the heists, the echoes of the old killer's twisted philosophy. It was all here, undeniable proof etched in ink. Further in, a recurring symbol appeared in the margins, a stylized, interlocking set of gears. Not just a random doodle, but a signature. I remembered seeing it before, fleetingly in the background of an old case photo on a workshop wall. A place where the original killer had once worked, years before his rampage began. A place he had frequented, a place where he might have taught someone, and then a name. The engineer, someone who built, who designed, who understood intricate mechanisms. And suddenly a face swam into my mind. Not a face from the original case files, but a face I had seen recently. The one who always seemed to be just out of focus, always there, watching. The one who knew the informant's movements, knew where he'd be. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The heists were not just about money, they were about legacy, about completing a morbid masterpiece. And I was the final piece, the instrument of their twisted justice. They hadn't failed to catch the original, they had simply paused. And now they had returned, more cunning, more dangerous, with me squarely in their sights. The cargo plane, once a refuge, now felt like a trap. I was exposed, vulnerable, and the architect, the engineer, was watching. The cold metal of the plane seemed to vibrate with a silent threat. I had unraveled the truth, and in doing so, I had painted a target on my own back. The leather journal, a dark secret, lay beside his splayed fingers, a silent witness to his abrupt end. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the sudden quiet. The air, thick with the scent of stale concrete and something metallic, seemed to press in, suffocating. I didn't move for a long moment. The image of the blunt instrument, swift and merciless, burned into my vision. The perpetrator, a shadow dissolving into the deeper gloom of the alley, left no trace but the chill in the air and the stark finality of death. This wasn't just a message, it was a declaration. My legs, leaden moments before, found their purpose. This wasn't just a ledger of illicit dealings, it was a killer's chronicle. Back in the stale air of my cramped apartment, the city's distant hum a muffled drone. I splayed the journal open under the weak glow of a single lamp. The pages, brittle and yellowed, were filled with precise, almost artistic script. Not names and dates of victims, as I had grimly anticipated, but a macabre inventory. Descriptions of objects, not bodies. Each entry detailed the acquisition of a specific item, often mundane: a chipped ceramic bird, a tarnished silver locket, a child's worn wooden toy. My fingers traced a crude sketch on one page, a familiar silhouette. It wasn't a building, but a vessel, a cargo plane, and underneath it, a series of coordinates hastily jotted down, almost an afterthought. The last heists had been preparatory, the acquisition of these resonant objects. Now it was time for the grand unveiling. The coordinates led to the old municipal airstrip, abandoned for decades, a graveyard of forgotten ambitions. Specifically, they pointed to the cargo plane on abandoned Runway, a rusted hulk that had long served as a landmark for local delinquents and urban explorers. Why there? What grand, twisted tableau was being prepared? I moved with a desperate urgency, the journal clutched in my hand. My old sedan, a grumbling beast of faded glory, ate up the miles, each turn of the wheel a testament to the mounting tension within me. The city lights receded, replaced by the inky blackness of the outskirts, broken only by the occasional distant glow of a farmhouse. The air grew cooler, carrying the damp scent of neglected earth and stagnant water. A skeletal fence, half-collapsed, marked the perimeter. My headlights cut through the gloom, painting the desolate scene in stark relief. The plane, a relic of a bygone era, sat motionless, its metal skin corroded, windows shattered like vacant eyes. The air hummed with an unnatural stillness. No flickering lights, no distant engine thrum, just the vast, empty expanse. The coordinates from the journal pointed to the cargo bay doors, gaping open like a hungry maw. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight filtering through cracks in the fuselage. I swept my flashlight beam across the floor, expecting anything: a body, a bomb, a message. But the cargo bay was empty, save for a single object placed precisely in the center. It was a small, wooden bird, hand-carved, its wings spread as if in perpetual flight. Its paint, once a vibrant blue, was faded and chipped. My breath caught. I knew this bird. I had carved it myself, years ago, for a child who had looked at me with an unshakable trust. It was a gift for the daughter of a colleague, the one who had stubbornly believed in me even when the world had turned its back. The colleague who had just last week passed me a cryptic note about a new pattern of thefts, a lifeline I had clung to. Attached to the bird's leg, a small, tightly folded piece of paper. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. The script was elegant, precise, utterly devoid of emotion. The little bird sings a lonely song, Cole. It longs for its nest and its mother. She misses you, doesn't she? Your contact, the one who still foolishly believes in the disgraced. A sentimental weakness. I will ensure her sorrow finds its perfect echo. Midnight. This wasn't just a copycat. This was deeply, terrifyingly personal. The wooden bird, a forgotten token of a fragile hope, was a direct, cruel taunt. How could the perpetrator know of my connection to that specific colleague? How could they know about the bird, a personal gift from years past? This went beyond mere replication of old crimes. It was a deliberate, intimate wound. The meticulous planning, the collection of resonant objects. It wasn't just about reliving a past killer's glory. It was about me. The perpetrator wasn't just mimicking, they were targeting. My hands clenched, the note crumpling in my fist. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The original killer, the one I had failed to catch, had cultivated a perverse obsession with me. The stakes weren't just raised. They had become inextricably tangled with my own haunted history. My failure then was being used as a weapon now. The thought that I might have led this danger to her, to the only person who had offered me a sliver of faith, was a bitter, nauseating draft. I had to move, and quickly, before the little bird's song turned into a dirge. The splintered wood of the bird, still vivid in my mind's eye, was a clawed hand reaching from the past, clutching at my throat. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a whisper of intimate knowledge, a cruel reminder of a broken trust, a forgotten promise. How could they know of my connection to that specific colleague, the one whose quiet faith I had so thoroughly shattered? The question had gnawed at me, a relentless current against the dam of my resolve, until a different thought, sharper and colder, had pierced through. They knew because they had to. This wasn't a game of chance or broad strokes. It was a surgical dissection of my history. The air on the abandoned tarmac was a biting wind, carrying the scent of rust and distant rain. Above me, the skeletal ribs of the cargo plane on abandoned runway stretched into the bruised sky, a hulking metallic whale beached on a desolate shore. Its skin, once gleaming, was now scarred with patches of corrosion, a testament to neglect and the patient erosion of time. This was the place I had decided. My boots crunched on loose gravel as I moved, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness. The interior of the plane was a cavern of echoes, the metallic tang of old fuel clinging to the air. I walked its length, my gaze tracing the empty cargo bay, each rivet and strut a silent witness to 1,000 forgotten journeys. The bait was simple, yet potent, woven from the threads of my own failure. I positioned it carefully, a faded, creased file, a duplicate of the original case report from the unsolved murders that had undone me, that had cost me everything. But this copy held a subtle alteration, a single, carefully placed detail, a misdirection intended for eyes that knew the original intimately. It was a phantom clue, a breadcrumb leading not to the killer, but to a different kind of truth. I thought of the perpetrator, their meticulous planning, their taunts, their cruel mirroring of a past I desperately wanted to forget. They saw themselves as an artist, perhaps, painting a masterpiece of chaos with my life as their canvas. And artists I knew were prone to vanity. They craved an audience, an acknowledgement of their genius. My trap wasn't just about catching them. It was about feeding that hunger, then turning it into ash. As I placed the file on a rusted pallet near the plane's open maw, a sudden clarity struck me, a jolt that reverberated through my bones. The wooden bird, the colleague, the specific details of the old case. It wasn't just that the perpetrator knew about these things. It was that they cared. They cared enough to use them, to craft them into barbs aimed directly at my conscience. And to care so deeply, to wield such intimate knowledge, suggested not a distant observer, but someone woven into the very fabric of that unraveling. The colleague, then, it wasn't just about my connection to them. It was about their connection to the deeper currents of that forgotten investigation. The perpetrator didn't just know of my colleague. They knew through them, or perhaps because of them. It wasn't a random taunt. It was a calculated signal, confirming my growing suspicion that the old case, my failure, had been a three-sided coin. Not just the killer and me, but a third player, a silent observer, pulling strings from the periphery. Someone who had watched the original events unfold, perhaps even facilitated them, and now sought to reenact the drama with me as the central, suffering character. This changed everything. The person I was hunting wasn't merely a copycat. They were an archivist of my despair, a curator of my past mistakes, and a sculptor of my future torment. The wind whistled through the gaps in the fuselage, a mournful, solitary sound. I checked the small device in my palm, its red light a steady, reassuring pulse. A simple motion sensor rigged to a camera pointed directly at the bait, crude perhaps but effective in this desolate expanse. Doubt, a familiar companion, began to whisper at the edges of my resolve. Had I truly understood their motivation, their intricate dance of cruelty? What if I had miscalculated and this trap was merely another step into a deeper snare of their own making? The thought was a bitter taste on my tongue. The perpetrator had always been one step ahead, their moves anticipated, their intentions opaque. There was I, in my desperation, merely playing into their hand, allowing myself to be drawn further into their twisted narrative. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Each creak of the plane, each distant rustle of dry weeds became a potential harbinger. My breath caught in my chest, a tight knot of anticipation. I scanned the perimeter, my eyes straining against the encroaching twilight. The horizon bled into hues of bruised purple and angry orange, painting the skeletal plane in stark relief. Then a flicker, not a sound but a subtle shift in the air, a disturbance in the otherwise perfect stillness. A distant glint, almost imperceptible from the edge of the abandoned runway where the last vestiges of light clung to the weeds. The trap was set. Now the waiting, a predator's patience, honed by years of chasing ghosts. Climaxed the wind. A ghost with an icy breath tugged at my coat as I stepped onto the abandoned runway. Ahead, a behemoth of rusted metal hunkered in the twilight, the cargo plane on abandoned runway. Its shell, once polished silver, was now a patchwork of dull gray and peeling paint, reflecting the bruised sky in fractured shards. This was where the splintered bird had led me, to a place where forgotten promises met their brutal end. My breath plumed, a fleeting testament to the chill that had nothing to do with the air and everything to do with the knot tightening in my gut. The ramp was lowered, a gaping more inviting me into its metallic belly. No lights, no sounds but the whine of the wind through unseen cracks and the frantic drum of my own pulse. Each step on the corrugated metal floor echoed, a hollow clang that seemed to amplify the vast emptiness. The air inside was thick with the scent of stale jet fuel and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet like old blood. My hand instinctively went to the weight at my hip. I moved slowly, methodically, my eyes straining, trying to discern shapes in the gloom. Crates stacked high formed an obstacle course, their faded stenciled labels hinting at forgotten journeys. Then a flicker, not light but movement. The figure stepped into a shaft of moonlight, and the air left my lungs in a ragged gasp. He clutched a heavy wrench, its head glinting ominously. I breathed the word a curse. All this time, the bird I remembered, a symbol of our shared pursuit, Cole, of the justice we swore to deliver, a promise you broke. I broke nothing, I retorted, my voice regaining its steel. I tried to stop him. I failed, yes, but I didn't become him. Didn't I? He took a step closer, the wrench held loosely at his side. I was too soft, Cole, too burdened by rules. I saw the monster, but I never understood the art, the true message. He taught me after I walked away, after I let him slip. His gaze was unnervingly steady. He taught me how to finish what he started. A wave of nausea washed over me. The original killer hadn't just inspired him, he had mentored him. Or worse, this detective was the original killer, having faked his disappearance, using his position to orchestrate chaos under a new guise. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the man before me with the one I had shared late-night coffee and case files with. "This isn't justice," I answered, my voice tight. "This is madness. Ira replicating his work, taking lives." Replicating, no, Cole, refining, perfecting, the flaws in his early designs, the moments of hesitation. I've ironed them out, and I, the great Cole, still missed it. The patterns, the subtle shifts. He was going to escape in this very plane, wasn't he? And I helped him. A flicker of something, pride, regret, crossed his face before it hardened again. He had a vision, a purpose, and I, with my righteous indignation, snuffed it out, so I picked up the brush, and now Ira going to watch me finish the masterpiece. He lunged without warning, the wrench whistling through the air. The fight was immediate, brutal. He moved with a speed and ferocity I hadn't anticipated, fueled by years of simmering resentment and a twisted ideology. He swung again, aiming for my knees. I blocked with my forearm, a jolt of pain shooting up to my shoulder. This wasn't the clumsy brawl of a desperate man. This was calculated, precise violence. "I let him get away, Cole," he snarled, pushing me back against a stack of crates. The wood groaned under the impact. "I let us down. He was a killer," I yelled, grappling for control. "And I ran no different." He twisted, using his weight to pin me, the wrench now pressed against my throat. His eyes, in the faint light, held a disturbing glint. "No, Cole, I'm better. I learned from my mistakes, from his mistakes, the final heist. It's all here, the culmination, and I, my old partner, get a front row seat." My lungs burned, struggling for air. His grip was immense, the cold metal of the wrench digging into my windpipe. He was stronger than I remembered, or perhaps the years of guilt and failure had simply worn me thin. He had planned this meticulously, just like the heists. Every word, every move designed to break me. "Why now?" I rasped, desperate to buy time to understand. His lips curved into a cruel smile. "Because the world needed a reminder, and I needed to remember what I truly failed to see. The truth was always there. Cole, in the cracks, in the details I dismissed. The real monster wasn't the one I chased, it was the one I ignored, the one who walked among us." He pressed down harder, my vision beginning to gray at the edges. Had I truly been so blind? Had I misjudged him completely, not just in the past, but even now? The thought was a bitter poison, threatening to unravel my resolve. But then the image of the splintered bird, the symbol of broken trust, flashed in my mind. It was a promise, yes, but also a warning, and I wouldn't break this one. With a surge of adrenaline born of desperation and a renewed sense of purpose, I twisted, bringing my knee up hard into his groin. He gasped, his grip momentarily loosening. It was all I needed. I shoved his back, rolling away, scrambling to my feet. The wrench clattered to the floor, a metallic shriek in the echoing plane. He was momentarily stunned, clutching himself. "It ends here," I responded, my voice hoarse but steady. The pressure on my windpipe intensified, stars blooming behind my eyes like shattered glass. The world narrowed to the vise of the colleague's forearm, the faint scent of stale coffee clinging to his sleeve. Had I truly been so blind? The thought, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of oxygen deprivation. Not just in the past, but even now, all those late nights, the shared theories, the feigned concern, a grand, elaborate misdirection. The true architect had been beside me all along, a shadow in plain sight. I clawed at his arm, the thick muscle unyielding. My lungs burned, demanding air, but my mind, strangely clear in its panic, began to connect the fractured pieces. The subtle shifts in his demeanor when I spoke of the original killer's meticulousness. The way he'd subtly steered my focus away from certain leads, always with a plausible explanation. The uncanny accuracy of his hunches that always seemed to put me a step behind the actual events. A desperate surge of adrenaline coursed through me. This wasn't just about catching a killer, it was about survival. My foot found purchase on the fuselage wall of the cargo plane on abandoned runway, leveraging my weight. With a guttural grunt, I twisted, aiming an elbow for his ribs, then another harder into the soft tissue beneath his chin. He grunted, the pressure on my throat momentarily easing as he reeled back, stumbling against a stacked crate, all of it. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a grotesque parody of an acknowledgement. "The heists, a masterpiece, wouldn't you say? A tribute and a challenge. I knew you couldn't resist. Your predictable Cole, always chasing the ghosts of your failures." He gestured around the cavernous interior of the cargo plane on abandoned runway, his arm sweeping past the crates that held the stolen goods, the final haul. This was the last act, the grand finale, and you the starring role in your own public humiliation. Why? The single word was ripped from me, laden with years of torment. The original case, the methods, you mirrored them exactly. A cruel smile stretched his lips. Mirrored, my dear Cole, I created them. Those were my methods. The original killer, as you called him, was merely a convenient fiction, a way to watch you stumble, to see you break. You were so close so many times, but always just a step behind. The public clamored for an arrest, and you, the golden boy, failed spectacularly. It was delicious. The confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating as the exhaust fumes from the distant engines. The ground beneath me seemed to tilt. The weight that doesn't add up, moments from years ago, the inexplicable gaps in the original investigation that had haunted my waking hours, the loose ends I could never quite tie, they all snapped into place with sickening clarity. The anonymous tips that always led to dead ends, the evidence that was just a little too asterisk clean, the witnesses that evaporated. It wasn't incompetence, it was sabotage. A man like you, Cole, needed a purpose, and I provided it. A new game. A chance at redemption, or so you thought. He laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed through the metal shell of the cargo plane on abandoned runway. You were so desperate to believe it was a copycat, a new threat. It never occurred to you that the original threat simply evolved. My gaze flickered to the heavy wrench lying near a crate, forgotten by the crew who had loaded the pilfered cargo. He followed my eyes, his smile widening. Thinking of fighting, Cole? You're a disgraced man. Who would believe you now? Your reputation is in tatters. Mine, however, is impeccable. A trusted colleague trying to help a friend who's clearly losing his grip. He lunged, not with a weapon, but with the intent to overpower. I sidestepped, my reflexes sharpened by years of street brawls and adrenaline-fueled chases. He stumbled past me, momentarily off balance. He was stronger than he looked, fueled by a deranged conviction, but I had the advantage of surprise and the raw, unadulterated fury of a man betrayed. The wrench connected with a sickening thud against his shoulder as he tried to disarm me, and he cried out, clutching it. I didn't hesitate. Every past failure, every sleepless night, every ghost that had haunted me surged into that moment. He went down hard, sprawling amidst the crates, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, the wrench having done its work. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a dawning comprehension, not of defeat, but of something akin to disbelief. You actually did it. I stood over him, my chest heaving, the wrench still gripped tight in my trembling hand. The resolution wasn't a sudden burst of light, but a slow, dawning calm. The weight I had carried for so long, the crushing burden of a failure that wasn't mine alone, finally began to lift. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, cutting through the night. The other detective, the one I had called before the colleague had revealed his true colors, was finally here. They would find him disarmed and broken amidst his ill-gotten gains. They would find me standing over him, the truth finally laid bare. I looked down at the colleague, no longer seeing a friend but a carefully constructed monster. My own reflection stared back at me in the polished metal of a nearby crate, a man scarred but not broken. The demons weren't gone, not entirely, but they no longer held me captive. I had confronted them, and in doing so, I had finally, truly, caught my killer. The cargo plane on abandoned runway, once the stage for his final triumph, had become the site of his downfall and my own hard-won absolution.